everyone, and welcome to this episode of our podcast, Getting to Better Together, sponsored by the Centre for International Development, Social Entrepreneurship and Leadership at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and supported by Noosa Radio FM 101.3. I'm your host, Richard Bawden. Before proceeding further, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. When we talk of getting to better together, we assume that there are advantages to be gained by cooperating and collaborating in the pursuit of betterment. Why is this so? What happens when we do work together that's absent when we work alone? Sharing the burden, exploiting diversity, expanding our range of competencies and capabilities, exploring differences in opinions and values and assumptions and knowledge are among the obvious benefits. But surely there's more to it than that. Is it possible that when we really work closely together in some form of collective or another, that we achieve a state of group consciousness where we can feel so immersed in the culture of the group, be it a commercial business, a voluntary organization, educational institution, a sporting team or whatever, that we feel that we're being embraced by a sense of a collective spirit? It's not just that we are working together, but that somehow or another we are as one. It brings a special feeling to togetherness that allows us to flourish in our collective endeavours. What happens when the all too common I am focus of our everyday world is replaced in these circumstances by a very powerful, almost spiritual commitment to we are? Experience suggests that this is by no means a universal phenomenon. Some organisations flourish while others fail to do so. My guest today, Dr. Helen Russ, has been researching into these matters and consulting with organisations from a unique we are perspective for a very considerable length of time. Helen's investigations have included working with organisations overseas, especially Ireland and the United States, as well as within Australia. And I'm delighted to welcome her here this afternoon to explain the fascinating and vital insights that she's gained through her work, such as being the uniqueness of her contribution that she's coined her own word to describe it, and I'll leave it to her to introduce the concept and what it means in practice. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Richard. That's lovely.
What's your word? What does it mean, and what's its significance?
What's it mean? So the word is lexion, and there's three components: lexion, capital L, and an elexion, which are the three components of an organisation. Lex is actually an old word. That it was in ancient Greek and ancient Latin. It's both been used. In Latin, it means lex Romanos, as the law of Rome, or lex Moses, as the law of Moses. And it means law, L-O-R-E in Latin, law, L-A-W, and dharma, which is the way. Right. In ancient Greek, it means the word, as in the beginning was the word. So it's the first emanating principle of anything. Right. And in organizations or in groups, there is an energy, as you said in your introduction. Whenever a group of people gather, they always gather for a reason. If it's a mistake, there is some reason for the gathering, and there is a spirit of the group that forms, whether we want it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not.
And that's always so. Huh?
It's always so. Yeah. It's like, if you think of it as you have a presence, so Richard has a presence, and Helen has a presence, and every person has a presence. Right. And when we're, as an individual, when we're in a physical body, we perceive ourselves as separate. I am here, you are there. But when we come together in a group, and it doesn't have to be physically together, it can be online or over a distance, there is this energetic spirit where our presence, our consciousness is not limited by space and time. It's the beings that are created when we come together exist in, if you like, the fourth dimension. And so they behave under the laws of the fourth dimension. We exist, our physical body in any case exists in the third dimension, or we recognize ourselves in the third dimension, where we exist under the laws of space and time. So we are held in place by gravity, and we cannot move in time, and we can move around in space. Whereas the part of consciousness that exists, that groups are associated with, doesn't have the same limitations. So it's not limited by space and time in the same way we are.
Nice.
Yeah.
So we have it now, you and I talking.
Yeah, we wouldn't have a full lexion, but we have a presence, a combined presence. And the more we communicate, the more it will build. So as I share things with you, and then as you share things with me, the space of consciousness begins to become something. The things with Lexians are that under about 25 people, and this is, you know, a loose figure, the Lexian is dependent on the founders. So if you and I were founding an organization and we gathered 20, 25 people around us, it would be dependent on our emotional and mental stability. If, for example, there was one of us had a divorce or got very sick, that would send waves through the Lexian, through the spirit of the group that we created. If, on the other hand, we'd created an organization with, say, 300, if something happened to you or I, even if we're a founder, it will not destabilize the Lexian in the same way, because after about 25, it's become a being in its own right.
I was going to ask you if there is an optimal number, and that's about it. Is it a couple of dozen?
Well, there's real levels and gradients in these beings. Like you get between about 30, let's say, something like that, and 150 is kind of one sized organism. Then you get up into the thousands and it's a different sized organism, and it behaves differently. And then you get into the Google examples, you know, where you've got literally millions of people participating, and that is a different beast again.
Right. When we participate in social networks and so on, are we aware of that? I mean, can we become aware of it?
So you would be, Richard. Just that your listeners, I've known Richard for a long time. Corporate wizards, they're people who can come into an organization and they apparently do nothing, but they seem to lift the organization out of the gutter and put it on a good trajectory. They're people who do this intuitively, right? So the only difference with my work, you've got people like Napoleon or popes or leaders, people who've changed history through, you know, Gandhi, for example. People like this have an understanding of this phenomena, but they do it intuitively. And we've had no collective or agreed language to talk about it. The only thing I'm doing that's different really is that I have brought a language and a structure to it so that you and I can discuss it.
Isn't that fascinating? So an organization calls you. What's the trigger for them calling you in the first place?
Oh, it's if the organization is not firing on all cylinders in whatever way, if it's not functioning, it's not happy. And it's quite interesting. When I was doing my research, I was in the States and I was at a non-for-profits conference and I was talking with someone and they said, "Oh, would our organization want you?" And I saw the spirit of the group look down its nose at me and say, "No." Like this. Yes. So not all organizations want to be looked at. Ones that generally want to do well and bring goodness to the world are much more likely to. I'll have other people where, I mean, if you want to get a job in an organization, talk to the spirit of the group. Don't bother talking to the CEO. I mean, you have to as well, because social protocol suggests it. But in actual fact, if you want an organization to do something for you, tune into the spirit of the group. You might have to write a letter. I remember doing this years ago. You might have to write a letter to get a council or a board or somebody to agree to something. Tune into the spirit of the group, find where the spirit of the group will say yes, and then write your letter from there.
That's good. Well, as you are aware, because yes, indeed, we did meet many, many years ago. We were in a group where a small group of us academics, I believe, shared a particular essence or spirit that we actually couldn't convey, but other people could recognize, including the students. We were academics. We were involved in a really exciting educational radical innovation, I guess, initiative. And the three of us or four of us really recognized that between the four of us, we had something special, which I'm delighted to say continues to this day. The rest of the organization didn't necessarily share that. And yet, somehow or another, the energy of those four carried us through. Is that typical?
Lexians are held in place by people. And this is the thing that a lot of organizations forget. It's actually the heart and spirit of individuals that keep a Lexian or the spirit of a group aligned. So the spirit of the group does not have a heart in the way that we have a human heart. And the human heart is the thing that allows us to connect through all levels of creation. What's interesting with Lexian is that the structure of the word takes your consciousness up to the archetype in what Plato would call an archetype, as in, for a horse to exist somewhere, there's a perfect essence of horseness.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that situation, you and some of the other members, some of the other four that you're talking about, would have been connected to the Lex, right? And the Lex is a living form. It's not, you can call it an ideal or an idea, but it's actually alive. And when you're connected to that, you're connected to the one life of which we all participate.
Mm-hmm.
And as such, your ideas, when you're aligned with that, you align your consciousness with that. And this is what I call a corporate wizard would do, right? They come into an organization, they align their consciousness with the perfect form,
Mm-hmm.
and they constantly get ideas and solutions to enliven. All Lexians, all beings want to achieve their greatest potential. And
Mm-hmm.
so what happens to organizations is that they get disconnected from their Lex, and there's no individual in the organization that cares enough, and I mean that the caring is absolutely important,
Mm-hmm.
to keep the organization connected to its Lex. In the situation with you four cared very, very deeply about what was happening. And so you aligned with the Lex, consciously or not. Some of you are probably more conscious, more aware of what you were doing than others, but it's that ability to connect with the Lex that brings the life, it brings direction, and it brings like enlivening, solution, awakening to the spirit of the group. And when people, so you four, are consciously and actively communicating with the spirit of the group is like this soft, supportive breeze behind everything you do, right? The spirit of the group communicates with the other Lexian that you had to navigate through the university, right? They communicate, and it might happen through people, but it'll often happen in a really relaxed, uncomplicated way, just, you know, over a coffee, or someone will say something and then the spirit of the other group hears it through the words of that person. And it's like, oh no, this group will support us as well. And so there's a thing about respecting all life forms, and the spirit of the group is a life form with its own destiny, its own, it wants to achieve its greatest potential, whatever that is.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that people use without discomfort words like spirit and human spirit and so on, and recognize what that means. And they also recognize, I believe, the sort of sense that you've been talking, the essenceness of something that's alive and that is shared and so on. And yet the moment you mention the word spiritual, people go blank and go blazy-eyed and you think, what a shame that is, because it's a perfect word to really try to move people into a relatively comfortable zone still about talking about things that mostly people don't talk about.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Lexian's a great word because it's an old word. And as I said, in consciousness, people have called the spirit of the group lots of things. One term that's been used is meme. And I was doing that in my research. And the thing with meme is when you involute into the spirit of an organization, using the term meme, your consciousness circles at the lower levels because it's got no linguistic foundation and no theoretical foundation. Whereas you use Lexian and it literally takes your consciousness up to the Lex. Your consciousness naturally looks for the Lex. It's interesting around words.
Oh, I mean, it's a bizarre thing to me that if you say a word like epidemiology, for instance, with COVID, everybody knows what that word means now, and pandemic and so on. And yet if you mention a word that's similar, like epistemology, for instance, which is simply the philosophy of knowledge, again, people go blanky-eyed, and you think that's a great tragedy, because if people actually ask the question, what do you mean by that? We would make huge progress, because as I say, I think everybody works is aware of situations where when we're working together, there is something special about that togetherness.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it links to emanation and consciousness. And we're all living in one unified field.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I think now is that I think a lot of us are not as afraid of the word spiritual. Perhaps the word spiritual has a little word gravity, but I think a lot of us are looking for ways to talk about different levels of consciousness from just quite a pragmatic front. This model, the work I've done, rests on Plato, a 9-dimensional level of consciousness, where we're physically at the third, but we have subtle bodies through all dimensions. And so we are actually, there's a part of us cognizant at all dimensions.
Right. Is there a nexus here between, say, yoga and meditation and this notion of heightened group consciousness?
The interesting thing that I've found is that most spiritual traditions have worked, as you mentioned at the beginning, they've worked with the I am, and we haven't worked with the we are. We actually don't know what happens when people come together. One of the huge issues in organizational culture, in management, has been the management of culture. How do you work with it when you've got a culture that's dysfunctional, that's dragging its feet, that's dishonest perhaps, and people do all kinds of things that are effectively rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic because they only work with third dimensional consciousness. I had an organization in Ireland, and they'd had about a dozen people, I think it was, who'd spoken up. They'd asked for feedback about what was happening in the organization, and there was about a dozen who'd spoken up, and all of them had been fired within the next little while, few months.
Oh, wow.
And so the whole organization would not say anything. And so they started writing on the tagline on their emails, "It's safe to speak up." But it's like putting a Band-Aid on an ulcer. You haven't actually addressed the mistrust and the rot that's in the spirit of the group. So what they're doing is they're working at a third dimensional level, but the problem is in the consciousness of the group. So unless you start, if you can actually look the spirit of a group in the eye. You can ask it what it wants, what's wrong, and it will tell you. It will. The funniest thing, Richard, is when I start to work with them, and they often say things like, "Oh my God, she can see me." Like this.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? Let me take a great big leap here in terms of awareness, not just necessarily consciousness, but awareness of the fact that political systems around the world at the moment, one can say almost generally are dysfunctional or becoming increasingly dysfunctional. What can we do there in terms of Lexion and its application?
Oh, it's a big question. The thing is, you need to look at the forces behind whatever you're running, be it a corporation or a political system or a movement. Are always, so as I said, whenever people gather, a group spirit is also created. Get to a certain number and it becomes a being in its own right. Get to a different number and it becomes a player within the global consciousness. Right? It becomes, in actual fact, a stream of consciousness that if there are bigger streams around, the bigger stream will take over. Right? Take 9/11 as an example. It's completely and utterly altered international travel.
Yes, that's right, isn't it?
Right? We now have a system that is much more controlled, much more, the security level is massively increased. And if you had individual airports and they were allowed in their own way to make their own decisions, I doubt we would have such a high levels of security. But you've got these much bigger forces moving through the collective psyche of humanity. And so the small airport, the spirit of the small airport gets influenced, like a bit like dye in water. It gets influenced, the consciousness, the spirit of the group gets altered by something like 9/11, and consequently it starts introducing a whole lot of perhaps overly strict security measures that are completely unnecessary in its particular situation. And we can see that everywhere. So what my research is about, in effect, is about raising our level of consciousness and taking responsibility for the beings we create and actually recognizing. So we are a unique category of beings in that we have a vehicle, which is the human heart, which enables us to connect to our own integrity all the time at all levels of creation. With our focus on the third dimension, we've kind of ignored that, and we've let the beings of the fourth dimension take over.
Yeah. I mean, many Eastern cultures both recognize and privilege the notion of group consciousness and higher consciousness, don't they?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, all spiritual traditions have got different ways of talking about this.
When I think about that every time I do one of these podcasts, and I quite rightly acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects. But it sounds so trivial compared to the respect that we really I ought to accede to the fact that there is a level of consciousness that enabled people to live in this continent for 50,000 years. With relative security and safety and comfort and happiness, I guess, and that we never really explore that.
I know.
My work, as you probably know, as I'm sure you will know, has not extended itself into the fourth dimension. It's been very much concerned with consciousness and reflexivity in terms of what it is that I know, what I value, the particular moral perspective that I have on life and how I come to that. But your work takes to a whole new dimension, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's essentially sourcing consciousness. If you want to change something in the physical, you have to source it. Plato talks about the analogy of the cave, the allegory of the cave, the analogy of the divided line. In the analogy of the cave, it's that what we see are actually shadows of what's going on at a different dimension. And that's the thing that's hard for us, as we've had such a focus on the physical, that we are multidimensional beings. We have access to all levels of consciousness naturally. We do within ourselves. All we need to do is to activate that ability.
And of course, following that allegory, what we see is distortion. It's not only not real in the sense of being corporal, but it's an image, and it flickers and it changes in the way that the original people, as it were, is not manifest. So it's them shadows that's moving because of light and because of all sorts of other things that are going on, rather than the being itself.
Yeah.
Helen, this has been wonderful.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Terrific conversation. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I shall go away and try and work on more often the conversion to we are from I am. Thanks a million.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was wonderful.
Thank you all for listening. I look forward to our next episode. Until then, goodbye.